The question that's long been asked is, should they be extended beyond that time? Something sure to come up during the debate today. But joining us to talk about that issue, Pat Toomey, who's the president for the Club for Growth, and Democratic strategist Margie O'Mara. Good to see you both. Thanks for joining us today. And very quickly, that's the question at hand, Pat. Why should those tax cuts be extended in your view?
Well, gee, let's see. Since we enacted those tax cuts in 2003, we've had 4 years of tremendous economic growth. Unemployment now averaging less than it has for 30 years. American families have record wealth. Stock market's at record high. Treasury, the U.S. federal government revenue coming in at a record pace. The deficit is now down to about half what it's been in the last 50 years. Wages are higher. I can't imagine a much better scenario, frankly.
I don't know where Pat's getting these numbers. If you talk to the American people, they do not feel this optimistic.
Well, the Wall Street Journal reported some of them today, including on the editorial page and in the news. Those are facts.
Well, the Wall Street Journal doesn't represent the American people.
Let me hear from Margie on this issue. Why shouldn't they be extended, Margie?
Well, you're talking about a bunch of Republican presidential candidates who want to be a rubber stamp for the most unpopular president in history and the least successful president in history. And the American people don't care about whether the billionaire boys club that is the Republican Party gets a tax break for help them pay for their 5th yacht. They want to be able to make it easier for them to pay for college, to send their kids to college, to pay for child care, to take care of their parents. And those are not the things that the Bush tax cuts or the Republican presidential field are really engaged in trying to help make happen.
Well, there's one problem with that argument, and that is that when we cut taxes in 2003, we cut taxes for everybody who paid taxes.
They haven't paid for themselves.
And that's a fact. And now the deficits are much, much smaller than projected. In fact, they're almost insignificant. At 1.2% of GDP, this is getting pretty trivial. If we can get spending under control, then we're not going to have a problem with deficits at all. The last thing we need is the huge tax increase that would be the effect of expiring these taxes.
Well, that's another problem, that the Republicans are not being true to their own core beliefs.
Let me bring John Harwood into the conversation here.
Pat, I want to ask you a question as a member of that billionaire boys club, and that is this.
I don't really qualify.
All the major Republican candidates are talking about extending the Bush tax cuts. Let's take that as a given.
Right.
What do you then do about the alternative minimum tax, which, as you know, is in a sneaky way taking back a lot of that tax cut, but government relies on it? If you got rid of it, it would cost $1 trillion over 10 years. We haven't heard much from the candidates. What do they need to say about that issue?
Well, actually, I think they do need to step up and take a position on that. And the right position is to eliminate this tax and not to replace it with a tax hike somewhere else, but to have some spending discipline so that we can grow this economy and we can easily afford this.
$100 billion of spending cuts a year? What are you talking about?
Over time, you could easily get to that point. You could do this. I mean, first of all, I like what Governor Romney's proposing by having appropriation bills that would be growing at less than the rate of inflation. If you eliminate the alternative minimum tax, that's a marginal income tax cut that would help grow this economy. That's a very powerful combination that we ought to be doing. But we also need entitlement reform, which has come up earlier on this show. Until we do that,
Margie, what's your view of the AMT? Obviously, the Democrats are positioning themselves to try and help the middle class. That's the hallmark of Senator Clinton's economic platform that she unveiled the other day. Would doing away with the AMT help the middle class enough to justify losing all the revenue that it would take with it?
Well, I mean, this is something that it should have been set to index to inflation when it began. It has not. People have been trying to fix it. What people want, what the voters want, is a grand vision of helping the average person. And I agree with Pat on entitlement reform. I think we should see more defense contractors being held accountable. They're getting entitlements from the federal government. And all of these other no-bid contracts are happening. I think we should reform those. Those kinds of entitlements, those are the types of things that the American people want to see get rid of.
Pat, I just want to know how much you'd have to cut Medicare and Social Security. We already know they're deep in a hole as it is, even if you don't eliminate the AMT. Then if you add $1 trillion on top of that, well, even if you assume there is some stimulus to the economy from tax cuts, that's an awful lot of money to do without.
The $1 trillion you're talking about is over 10 years. Remember, when the Bush tax cuts were passed in 2003, it was $1.3 trillion over 10 years, and we are already at a point where the deficit has almost disappeared. Revenue is coming in much greater than was projected both before and after those tax cuts because of the stronger economic growth. So I do believe, I do believe especially
Margie,
by lowering marginal income tax rates, we'd have the strong economic growth combined with spending discipline, we'd get there.
None of this is going to hide the fact.
Margie, where would you cut on entitlements? Which entitlements would you cut at this point?
Well, I think there's been a lot of good plans to reduce waste, as well as making sure that we're holding companies accountable for insurance and the insurance they provide, rather than giving away the store and making it easier for companies to take the government to the cleaners. And I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind. But I think ultimately the American people are looking for a grand vision on this, and they're just not seeing this. All this fighting on the Republican side is obscuring the fact that their party is in shambles and their field can't decide whether or not they want to be a rubber stamp for Bush or run away from him.
Well, I know, Pat, you want to respond, but I'm out of time at this point. Pat, Margie, thank you both for joining us.